At 58 years old, after 32 years of marriage, I watched my husband transfer every asset we had built together to a woman half my age. My lawyer sat across from me, pale and urgent. "Evelyn, you need to stop this immediately. If he signs everything over, you could lose it all." I folded my hands in my lap and said the only thing that made sense to me. Let him take it. Everyone in that room looked at me like I had just surrendered my life. The house, the beach property, the company, the accounts, decades of work, gone with the stroke of his pen. Richard smiled when he signed. Vanessa squeezed his arm like she had just won a prize. They thought I was a tired, aging wife who didn't have the strength to fight anymore. What my husband didn't realize was this. He wasn't taking everything from me. He was taking something far heavier than he understood. For 32 years, I was the woman behind the curtain. When Richard and I first started our company, we were in our 20s, broke, and living in a one-bedroom apartment with second-hand furniture and a borrow desk. I handled the numbers at the kitchen table. I tracked invoices, negotiated small contracts, studied tax codes late at night while he slept. Richard was the visionary, the charismatic one. He could walk into a room and make people believe in anything. But I was the one who made sure the belief didn't collapse under bad math. As the years passed, the company grew. So did his confidence. Interviews, awards, magazine features calling him self-made. I never corrected them. I didn't need the spotlight. I needed stability. I built our financial structure conservatively, carefully, layer by layer. Separate accounts, strategic reinvestments, protective clauses buried in contracts most people never read, including my husband. Somewhere around our 25th anniversary, I noticed the shift. It started subtly. Gym memberships, tailored suits, comments about reinventing himself. He began dyeing the gray out of his hair. He bought a sports car we didn't need. When I teased him about it, he said, "I'm not old yet, Evelyn." I hadn't called him old. Then came the distance. Late meetings. Weekends with investors. His phone face down at dinner. A new password. I didn't confront him the first time I saw her name flash across the screen. Vanessa. I waited. When you've been married for 3 decades, you learn the difference between suspicion and certainty. Suspicion is loud. Certainty is quiet. Certainty arrived the night he forgot to log out of his email on the home computer. I wasn't snooping. I was printing tax documents. Her message was still open. "I can't wait until everything is ours." Ours. I read it twice. Not because I didn't understand it, but because I did. When I finally asked him, I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I simply said, "How long?" He didn't deny it. "That's not the point," he replied, irritated, as if I had missed the larger issue. I deserve to be happy. I remember staring at him, this man I had built a life with, and thinking how strange it was that he sounded rehearsed, like he had practiced that line in the mirror. "She's young," he continued. "She makes me feel alive again." Vanessa was 29. I had seen her once at a company event. Long hair, perfect posture, the kind of confidence that comes from never having your stability threatened. "And what am I?" I asked. He hesitated just long enough. "You're not the woman I married." It was almost impressive how casually he said it, as if aging were a betrayal I had committed against him personally. After that, everything moved quickly. He stopped pretending. He began staying at her apartment more often than at our home. He started talking about clean breaks and new chapters. The language of reinvention. The language of erasure. Then came the day he said it plainly. "I'm restructuring the assets. Simpler this way. We'll transfer most of it. I don't want this to get messy." Most of it. The house. The beach property. The majority stake in the company. He spoke as if he were reorganizing furniture, not dismantling a marriage. "You'll be fine," he added. "You don't need all that responsibility anymore." Responsibility. For 32 years I had carried that word quietly. I had absorbed risks he never noticed, smoothed over mistakes he never knew he made, protected him from consequences he never felt. And now he was offering me freedom from it. I nodded. If he noticed how calm I was, he didn't question it. He mistook my silence for weakness, for exhaustion, for defeat. What he didn't understand was this. I wasn't afraid of losing what we built. I was curious to see what would happen when he finally owned all of it. Richard didn't waste time. Within a week of our conversation, meetings were scheduled. Documents were drafted. Calls were made behind closed office doors that were no longer meant for me to enter. For the first time in decades, I was treated like an outsider in the company I had helped build from scratch. He framed it as efficiency. "It's better this way," he told our attorney during a conference call I listened to in silence. "A clean transfer. Minimal conflict. Minimal conflict." As if 32 years could be dissolved like a business partnership. The first transfer was the beach house in Santa Rosa. We bought it 15 years ago after our best year in business. I remembered standing on the deck, barefoot, telling Richard we should put it in a limited liability structure to protect it. He laughed back then and said, "That's why I married you. You think about storms before the sky even changes." Now he was signing it away to Vanessa. She posted a photo there 2 days later. A glass of champagne. The ocean behind her. Caption: "New beginnings." I didn't react. Not publicly. Not privately. Next came the primary residence. The house where we raised our son. Where birthdays were celebrated. Where I once stayed up all night restructuring a failing quarter while Richard slept peacefully upstairs. "Transfer the deed," Richard instructed. "Full ownership." Daniel Brooks, my lawyer, called me that evening. "Evelyn, this is escalating," he said carefully. "If you contest it now, we can slow this down. At least force a valuation review." "I don't want to slow it down." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "At your age," he continued gently, "starting over financially isn't simple. Retirement security matters." Who said I was starting over? Richard's biggest move came next. 70% of his shares in the company transferred into his personal control structure, one he intended to merge with Vanessa's newly created holding entity. He was thorough in his arrogance, but not in his reading. I attended one of the signing meetings in person, not because I needed to, because I wanted to watch. Vanessa was there. White dress, subtle jewelry. She sat close enough to Richard that their knees touched. She didn't look at me directly, but she smiled when papers slid across the table toward him. I wondered what she believed she was inheriting. Security? Luxury? A future without limits? Richard signed each document confidently, barely skimming the pages. He trusted familiarity. He trusted routine. He trusted the fact that for 3 decades I had handled the complexities. He no longer had that shield. Daniel leaned toward me quietly while another set of forms was prepared. "Last chance," he whispered. "We can file an injunction." I shook my head. "Make sure," I said calmly, loud enough for the room to hear, "that the transfers include all associated obligations and successor responsibilities." Richard waved a dismissive hand. "Of course they do. Standard language." Standard language. Vanessa glanced at him briefly, as if to confirm everything was fine. He gave her a reassuring nod. They thought I was relinquishing control. What I was actually relinquishing was protection. By the end of the week, nearly everything visible was no longer in my name. The properties, the controlling shares, the accounts tied directly to company revenue streams. Friends began calling me quietly. "Are you okay? I can't believe he'd do that. Why aren't you fighting?" I gave them all the same answer. "I don't need to." That night, alone in the house that technically was no longer mine, I walked through each room slowly. I ran my hand along the staircase railing Richard once installed himself. I stood in the kitchen where I had balanced budgets that saved us from bankruptcy twice. I didn't feel panic. I felt something far steadier. Anticipation. Richard believed he was freeing himself from an aging wife and stepping into a lighter, brighter life. What he didn't understand was this. For 32 years I had been the one carrying the weight. and he had just insisted on taking it. There is a difference between being invisible and being underestimated. For most of our marriage, I allowed people to assume Richard was the architect of our success. He enjoyed the narrative, the self-made entrepreneur, the risk-taker, the bold decision-maker. What no one saw were the spreadsheets printed at midnight, the contingency plans drafted quietly when a contract looked unstable, the tax strategies reworked every December to prevent unpleasant surprises in April. I have a degree in finance. Richard has charisma. In the early years of the company, when cash flow was fragile and investors were cautious, I designed the structure that kept us alive. Separate subsidiaries, liability shields, personal guarantees tied to performance benchmarks. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was the reason we survived 2 recessions. Richard never liked reading contracts in full. He skimmed for numbers and deadlines. If I said, "It's covered," that was enough for him. And for 32 years I made sure it was. About 20 years ago, when the company crossed into 8 figures, I insisted on adding a clause to our shareholder agreements, something most founders overlook in their optimism. Full successor liability. It was simple in concept. Any party who assumed majority ownership of controlling shares would also assume full responsibility for outstanding obligations, tax exposure, loan guarantees, pending compliance reviews. Not partially, not proportionally, fully. Richard signed it without hesitation back then. We were united. There was no reason to question protection that safeguarded both of us. Years later, during an expansion phase, he personally guaranteed a sizable line of credit for $1 million to accelerate growth. I advised against the speed of it. He said we needed to be aggressive. "We're not small anymore, Evelyn. We can handle it." I quietly added additional language to reinforce the liability structure. If control shifted, so would the guarantees. He never revisited that paperwork. Recently, there had been murmurs of a routine tax audit. Nothing dramatic, just standard review due to rapid scaling. Still, audits are rarely simple when executive decisions have been ambitious. Richard handled more operational authority in recent years. He approved deductions I would have challenged, signed vendor contracts I would have renegotiated. Nothing illegal, just careless, overconfident. For 3 decades, I double-checked everything. In the last 2 years, he asked me to step back more often. "You've done enough," he'd say. "Let me handle it." So I did. When he began transferring the majority shares into his sole control structure, merging them toward Vanessa's holding entity, the trigger embedded 20 years ago quietly activated. Full successor liability. Total assumption of financial and legal responsibility. Daniel knew about it. He had been a junior associate when we first drafted the clause. "Are you sure you want to let this proceed?" He asked me privately before the final round of documents was prepared. "Once this goes through, he won't be able to reverse it easily. I'm aware. And if the audit findings escalate, they won't escalate for me." Daniel studied my face carefully. "You planned this?" "No," I replied honestly. "I prepared for it. Preparation is not revenge. It is foresight with patience." Richard believed he was walking away with assets, home, stock, prestige. He saw numbers on paper, equity percentages, market value. He didn't see the attached obligations. He didn't see the weight that had always been distributed quietly between us. There was one more detail he overlooked. 15 years ago, after a particularly volatile market year, I established a personal irrevocable trust funded through premarital assets and legally separate inheritance money from my parents. It was modest compared to the company's valuation, but stable, shielded, protected. He never paid attention to that either. "You're always so cautious," he used to tease. Yes, I am. When the final transfer documents were drafted, I read every page. Slowly, deliberately. I confirmed the language had not been altered. I ensured the successor clause remained intact. It did. Richard signed confidently. Vanessa smiled brightly. They believed I was surrendering power. What they didn't realize was this. Power isn't always loud. Sometimes it waits quietly in the fine print. The final signing took place on a Thursday morning. It was raining soft, steady rain that blurred the windows of Daniel's conference room and made the city outside look distant, almost irrelevant. I remember thinking how fitting that felt. 32 years of marriage reduced to a stack of paper and a series of signatures. Richard arrived first. Navy suit. New watch. The one Vanessa had posted about 2 weeks earlier with the caption, "Proud of you." He looked rested, lighter, as if he had already stepped into his next life and was simply waiting for the paperwork to catch up. Vanessa came in a few minutes later. White blouse, cream heels, polished, composed, careful not to appear triumphant, though the glow in her expression betrayed her. She sat beside Richard, her hand resting gently on his arm like she belonged there. I took my seat across from them. Daniel placed the documents neatly in front of us. His movements were slower than usual, deliberate. He glanced at me once, just once, as if asking for confirmation without speaking. I gave him a small nod. "This is the final transfer agreement," he said formally. "It includes full conveyance of the primary residence, the Santa Rosa property, and controlling interest in Carter Holdings. It also includes all associated obligations as outlined in prior shareholder agreements." Richard barely waited for the explanation to finish. "Let's not drag this out," he said. "We all know what this is." Yes, I did. The first document slid toward him. He signed without reading. The second, another quick signature. Vanessa leaned closer, whispering something that made him smirk. When the third document, transfer of controlling shares, landed in front of him, Daniel paused. "Just to reiterate," Daniel said carefully, "this agreement transfers majority ownership and full successor responsibility tied to existing corporate structures." Richard waved his pen dismissively. "Standard language. We've used the same framework for years." My hands were folded calmly in front of me. "Yes," I said softly. "We have." He signed. The sound of pen against paper echoed louder in my memory than it did in the room. Then the documents were turned toward me. "Your signature here, Evelyn," Daniel said quietly. For a moment the room seemed to wait. I could feel Vanessa watching me closely now, perhaps expecting hesitation, regret, emotion. Instead I picked up the pen. I signed the house away. I signed the beach property away. I signed the controlling shares away. Each stroke of ink was steady, clean, certain. Richard exhaled with something close to satisfaction. "I know this isn't easy for you," he said, almost kindly, "but this is better for everyone. We both deserve a fresh start." A fresh start. After 32 years he thought freedom meant subtraction. I placed the pen down carefully. "Daniel," I said, meeting my lawyer's eyes, "please confirm that all liability transfers are executed in full accordance with the shareholder agreement dated May 14th, 20 years ago." The room went still for a fraction of a second. Daniel cleared his throat. "They are." Richard frowned slightly just for a moment. "What does that matter?" he asked. "It doesn't," I replied evenly. "I just prefer clarity." Vanessa shifted in her chair. Richard shrugged. "Fine. Clarity." He leaned back satisfied. "Well, I suppose that's it." He stood, adjusting his jacket, already moving mentally beyond the room. Vanessa rose with him. She finally looked at me directly, offering a polite smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I hope you find what makes you happy," she said. I returned the smile. "I already have." Richard paused at the door. "You'll regret not fighting for more," he said. "You could have negotiated." "No," I answered calmly. "I couldn't have." He didn't understand the truth inside that sentence. I didn't need to negotiate. As the door closed behind them, the sound felt final, but not in the way they imagined. Daniel remained seated, staring at the signed documents. "Evelyn," he said slowly, "once these are processed, there's no easy reversal." "I'm aware." He studied me carefully. "You're certain?" I allowed myself the smallest breath of relief. "Yes." Outside, the rain continued falling. Steady, patient, unstoppable. Richard walked out of that building believing he had just claimed everything we built. What he didn't realize was this. For the first time in 32 years, he was walking out without me standing between him and the consequences. The call came 12 days later. I wasn't surprised by the timing. Processing large transfers takes time. Paperwork moves through departments quietly before reality begins knocking on the right doors. It was a Tuesday afternoon when Mark Feldman, the company's senior accountant, requested an urgent meeting with Richard. I know this because Mark called me first. Not out of loyalty, out of confusion. Evelyn, he said carefully, lowering his voice as if Richard might overhear through the phone. I'm reviewing the updated ownership filings, and I just need to confirm something. Yes, I asked. The successor liability clause. It's fully activated. I assumed it would be. There was a pause. You understand that means Richard now personally assumes all outstanding corporate guarantees and pending audit exposure? Yes. And that includes the accelerated line of credit and the tax position under review? Yes, Mark. Another pause, longer this time. Did he realize that? I didn't answer directly. You should explain it to him, I said gently. The meeting happened the next morning in Richard's new executive office. Formerly ours, now officially his. Vanessa was present. She had begun attending more internal meetings lately, positioning herself as part of the future. Mark later described the atmosphere to me in restrained detail. He laid out the documents one by one. Now that the ownership transfer is complete, Mark explained, the full successor liability provision assigns all corporate debt guarantees and pending compliance matters directly to you. Richard frowned. What compliance matters? The ongoing IRS audit review. That's routine. Yes, Mark agreed carefully. But under the updated filings, any reassessment, penalties or adjustments are now your sole responsibility. Richard leaned back, irritation flickering across his face. Fine. That's manageable. Mark hesitated before continuing. There's also the $4 million line of credit you personally guaranteed during the expansion phase. Because you now hold majority control independently, the bank reclassified the guarantee as directly enforceable. Vanessa spoke for the first time. Enforceable how? Mark adjusted his glasses. If the audit results in significant financial adjustment, or if liquidity ratios shift, the bank can demand accelerated repayment. From Richard personally. The room reportedly went very quiet. That's worst-case scenario, Richard said sharply. Yes, Mark agreed. But it is now entirely attached to you. Vanessa looked at Richard, confusion creeping into her expression. I thought the company carried the debt. It does, Mark clarified. But the successor clause transfers associated obligations with controlling interest. It was embedded 20 years ago. Richard's jaw tightened. That clause was mutual. It was, Mark said carefully. But with Evelyn relinquishing ownership, the mutual structure dissolved. The responsibility consolidated. Into one name. His. By Friday, letters began arriving. A formal notice from the bank requesting updated liquidity disclosures. An inquiry from the audit review requesting additional documentation. Routine technically, but routine feels different when you stand alone beneath it. Vanessa stopped posting photos. The beach house remained quiet on social media. Richard called Daniel that evening. Daniel kept the conversation brief and professional. Yes, the transfer included full successor responsibility. Yes, it was stated clearly. No, it cannot be partially reversed without Evelyn's consent. When Daniel informed me of the call, he sounded almost impressed. He didn't read it, Daniel said quietly. No, I replied. He never did. The first rail crack appeared 3 days later. The bank flagged a covenant ratio breach, minor, but enough to trigger review. Nothing catastrophic yet. Just enough to cause discomfort. Vanessa reportedly asked a question that lingered in the room longer than anyone expected. Wait, this includes debt? Mark confirmed gently. Yes. Not shared. Not partial. Full. That night, Richard called me for the first time since the signing. I let it ring twice before answering. "What did you do?" he demanded without greeting. "I signed what you asked me to sign." "You knew about the audit exposure?" "Yes." "You let this happen." I remained calm. "You insisted on taking everything." A long silence stretched between us. "This isn't over," he said finally. "No," I agreed softly. "It isn't." After we hung up, I sat in the quiet of my temporary apartment, the modest space I had moved into before the final transfer processed. No ocean view. No sweeping staircase. Just peace. For 32 years I had absorbed risk before it reached him. I had corrected errors before they matured into consequences. I had carried weight quietly so he could stand tall publicly. Now the weight had shifted. Not as revenge. As ownership. Richard believed he had claimed the future. What he was beginning to understand was far simpler. He had claimed the responsibility that came with it. The collapse didn't happen all at once. It unfolded the way structural failures usually do, quiet stress fractures before visible cracks. 2 weeks after Mark's meeting, the preliminary audit findings arrived. Not criminal, not catastrophic, but expensive. Several aggressive deductions taken over the past 3 years were flagged for reassessment. Penalties, interest, retroactive adjustments. When combined, the exposure climbed into 7 figures. Richard called an emergency executive meeting. This time Vanessa was not smiling. Mark presented the numbers with professional restraint. "If negotiated efficiently," he explained, "we can reduce the penalty, but liquidity will be strained. The bank will reassess the credit line under the revised ratios." Richard rubbed his temples. "We've handled tight quarters before." "Yes," Mark replied carefully. "But previously the liability was distributed. Now it wasn't." Within days, the bank issued a formal notice. Due to ownership restructuring and covenant concerns, the $4 million line of credit required additional personal collateral or accelerated repayment scheduling. Personal collateral. Vanessa stopped attending meetings. Instead, she began asking different questions at home. "Why didn't you know about this?" "It's temporary," Richard snapped. "It's just paperwork." "But paperwork has weight when you're the only one holding it." The press picked up a whisper about the audit. Nothing scandalous, just speculation. Investors began requesting clarification. 2 board members quietly resigned. For the first time in decades, Richard was alone in the storm. He called me again. This time he didn't shout. "You knew the audit was active." "Yes." "You knew about the personal guarantee." "Yes." "And you said nothing." "You didn't ask." Silence. "You set me up." I exhaled slowly, keeping my voice even. "No, Richard. I stopped protecting you." That was the moment he understood. For 32 years I had been the firewall, the quiet editor, the final review before signatures became commitments. He mistook that protection for irrelevance. 3 days later, he showed up at my apartment unannounced. Not the beach house. Not the estate he believed was his victory. My apartment. He looked older than he had a month ago. Not physically, but structurally, like something inside him had shifted under pressure. "You could fix this," he said without sitting down. "I could help you navigate it," I corrected. "Then do it." The demand was reflexive. Familiar. For decades, when tension rose, I absorbed it. I studied him for a long moment. Why would I? His jaw tightened. "Because we built this together." "Yes," I said quietly. "We did. And you're just going to watch it collapse?" "I'm watching you handle it." He stepped closer, frustration bleeding through composure. "This is millions of dollars." "I know. The bank can come after me personally." "Yes. And Vanessa." He stopped himself. "And Vanessa what?" I asked gently. He didn't answer. We both understood. Vanessa had not signed a successor liability clause 20 years ago. Vanessa had not personally guaranteed expansion loans. Vanessa had not reviewed compliance filings for 3 decades. She had inherited assets. He had inherited obligations. "You think this is revenge?" he said finally. "No," I replied. "Revenge would have required anger. I'm not angry." "Then what is this?" "Accountability." The word landed heavier than accusation. Outside, traffic moved normally. The world hadn't stopped. Markets were still open. People were still signing contracts without reading them. Richard ran a hand through his hair. "I can't carry this alone." For the first time, his voice wasn't defensive. It was honest. I held his gaze. "You insisted on taking everything." The truth in that sentence was immovable. Weeks passed. The bank restructured the credit line under stricter terms. Higher interest, shorter window. The audit negotiation reduced penalties slightly, but the financial hit remained substantial. Cash flow tightened. Personal reserves drained. Vanessa moved out quietly before the end of the month. No announcement. No dramatic exit. Just absence. Richard called once more after she left. "She says this isn't what she signed up for." I almost smiled. "She didn't sign anything," I said. That was the difference. By the end of the quarter, Richard began liquidating assets to stabilize the company. The beach house went on the market first. Then secondary investments. The fresh start he envisioned now required survival strategy. Meanwhile, my life grew quieter. Simpler. I met Daniel for coffee one morning. "He's restructuring aggressively," Daniel said. "He might recover long-term. It won't be easy." "I never wanted easy for him," I replied. Daniel looked at me carefully. "What did you want?" I considered the question. For him to understand the cost of ownership. Ownership isn't about possession. It's about responsibility. Richard believed wealth was measured in assets. What he learned slowly, painfully, was that wealth also carries weight. And for 32 years, I had been the one holding it. Vanessa was gone before the leaves began to turn. No dramatic confrontation. No public fallout. Just a quiet relocation to a smaller apartment across town, and a carefully worded social media post about prioritizing personal growth. She didn't mention Richard. She didn't have to. The beach house sold first, below asking price. Urgency weakens negotiating power. The proceeds barely softened the immediate pressure from the bank's revised terms. The credit line was restructured again. This time under stricter collateral requirements tied directly to Richard's personal holdings. Then came the primary residence. The house we raised our son in. I drove past it once while it was listed. A real estate sign stood in the yard like a flag marking conquered territory. Strangers walked through the rooms where I had once balanced budgets at midnight and hosted holiday dinners with extended family. I didn't feel bitterness. I felt distance. Richard called less frequently now. Not because things had improved, but because they hadn't. The audit concluded with a negotiated settlement that required a structured repayment plan over several years. Not ruinous. Not criminal. But humbling. Board confidence wavered. Investors demanded oversight adjustments. An external compliance officer was hired, something I had quietly recommended years earlier. The company survived. Smaller. Tighter. Watched more closely. Richard, however, did not emerge unchanged. Friends who once admired his boldness now described him as cautious. Measured. Hesitant before signing anything. He began reading contracts thoroughly, line by line. Experience is an unforgiving teacher. One evening, months after the signing, he asked to meet me for dinner. Neutral location. Quiet restaurant. He looked thinner. Not unhealthy, just stripped of something excess. "I sold the house," he said after we sat down. "I know." He nodded slowly. "I thought I wanted freedom. And I wanted admiration," he admitted. Honesty had replaced ego. It was almost unfamiliar. "I thought starting over meant upgrading," he continued. "New life. New partner. No complications. And now." He stared at his hands. "Now I understand what you were carrying." It wasn't an apology. Not fully. But it was recognition. For 32 years I had filtered risk, moderated expansion, questioned assumptions. I had been the quiet friction preventing disaster. He mistook friction for limitation. Without it, momentum becomes reckless. I didn't destroy you, I said gently. I know, he replied. The company remained in his name. The liabilities remained his responsibility. The restructuring plan would take years to complete. He asked if I would ever consider returning as a consultant. I shook my head. No, why not? Because I am no longer responsible for stabilizing what you insisted on owning. Instead, I said, I've done my part. After dinner, we walked out separately. I returned to my apartment, the one I had chosen intentionally. Modest. Secure. Entirely mine. The irrevocable trust established years ago continued to generate steady income. My retirement accounts, protected long before the unraveling, remained untouched. I had structured my life carefully, even when he thought I was simply being cautious. Caution is not fear. It is foresight. Months later, I received a brief message from him. I finally understand the clause. I didn't respond. Understanding doesn't require commentary. Richard believed he had taken everything. In reality, he had taken the debt, the exposure, the public scrutiny, the pressure of sustaining what he once shared. What I kept was quieter, stability, autonomy, peace. At 58, I did not need to rebuild a fortune. I needed to reclaim my weightlessness. And for the first time in 3 decades, I felt light. 3 years later, I ran into Vanessa at a charity luncheon. I almost didn't recognize her. Not because she looked different, but because she looked ordinary. The shine was gone. No designer entourage. No dramatic entrance. Just another guest holding a glass of sparkling water, scanning the room for someone more important to stand next to. She recognized me first. There was a flicker in her eyes, calculation, maybe embarrassment. It's hard to tell the difference. Margaret, she said, offering a tight smile. You look well. I am well, I replied. And I meant it. We exchanged polite, sterile small talk. She mentioned consulting work. A move. A new chapter. The language people use when they don't want to discuss what actually happened. She didn't ask about Richard. I didn't volunteer. But I had heard enough through mutual acquaintances. The company survived, but smaller. Controlled. Monitored. Richard stepped down as CEO the year after the audit restructuring. Officially, it was framed as a strategic leadership transition. Unofficially, it was a consequence. He remained a shareholder, still financially comfortable, but no longer the visionary empire builder he once proclaimed himself to be. Ambition without discipline eventually corrects itself. Vanessa excused herself when someone more influential approached. She drifted away easily, like someone accustomed to attaching and detaching based on opportunity. I watched her go without resentment. She didn't steal my life. She exposed what was already cracked. That evening, I returned home to my townhouse, the one I purchased quietly a year after the divorce was finalized. Not extravagant, but thoughtfully designed. Every room intentional. Every piece chosen because I loved it, not because it impressed someone else. The kitchen is sage green. Of course it is. I never painted over that color again. My son Daniel visits every Sunday for dinner. He's 30 now. Married. Expecting his first child. The trust one built long before the divorce helped him graduate debt-free. It helped him start a small engineering firm with 2 partners who value structure over spectacle. He once told me something that settled deeper than any courtroom victory ever could. You taught me that ownership means responsibility, he said. Not just control. Richard had wanted control. He signed for it. He carries it. I kept responsibility only for what was mine. People sometimes ask if I regret not fighting for more during the divorce. More cash. More assets. More visible wins. They assume victory is measured by what you extract. But here's what they misunderstand. I wasn't trying to win against Richard. I was trying to step out of a collapse without being crushed underneath it. There is a difference. Had I demanded half of everything, I would have inherited half the exposure. half the investigations, half the scrutiny, half the liability tied to decisions I did not make. Instead, I chose clarity. I chose separation, not just emotionally but financially and legally. And I chose patience. The most dangerous thing about underestimating a woman in her 50s is this: we are not impulsive. We are experienced. At 28, I might have screamed. At 35, I might have fought publicly. At 45, I might have tried to fix him. 58, I understood timing. Richard thought I was surrendering. In reality, I was transferring risk back to its origin. There is a quiet satisfaction in watching consequences unfold naturally. Without revenge, without sabotage, without deception. I didn't hide the numbers. I didn't falsify a single document. I didn't manipulate a single figure. I simply allowed him to claim what he believed he deserved. And he did. Everything. The assets. The liabilities. The image. The burden. What I walked away with cannot be itemized on a financial statement. Peace. Legal distance. A protected future for my son. And the dignity of not needing public validation. Last month, Richard sent me a letter. Not an email, not a text. A handwritten letter. He wrote that he finally understands the difference between acquisition and stewardship. He wrote that losing Vanessa was easier than losing credibility. He wrote that he now reads every line before signing anything. He ended with, "You were the only one who ever questioned me when it mattered." I folded the letter and placed it in a drawer. Closure does not require reconciliation. It requires understanding. If you are watching this story and wondering whether patience makes you weak, let me tell you something clearly. Patience is leverage when paired with preparation. Emotion reacts. Preparation waits. And waiting is not losing. It is choosing the moment when truth no longer needs defending. At 58 years old, I did not rebuild a fortune. I built insulation. From chaos. From liability. From ego-driven collapse. And when my granddaughter is old enough to ask about resilience, I won't tell her about courtrooms or audits or betrayal. I'll tell her this: own only what you are willing to carry. And never confuse taking everything with understanding its weight. That lesson cost Richard millions. Cost me nothing. Except time. And I spent that wisely.